My name is Bartley Grosserichter, and I'm the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, and I'm also the current president of the Yale Club of Germany. As many of you know, Munich Dialogues on Democracy is a cooperation between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's beautiful Amerikahaus. So we are also, tonight, we have the pleasure of co-hosting with the deutsch-kanadische Gesellschaft, the DKG, the German Canadians who are friends. This is the second time we're hosting with them, and I'm very pleased. For those of you who do not know them, I just wanted to say a few words about who they are too. The DKG is a nonprofit organization with the objective to strengthen the economic, cultural, and human ties between Germany and Canada. And since 1965, they've been annually organizing work and travel programs for students, internship programs for more advanced students, and networking platform for young professionals, both in Canada and in Germany. So the Munich chapter organizes 6 to 8 events a year, like the evening tonight, and they also have traditional German and Canadian social activities. So the driving force, though, of their activities is to make a substantial contribution to the transatlantic partnership. Now, this aligns perfectly with the mission of amerikahaus and with Munich Dialogues on Democracy. So again, it's wonderful to be cooperating. Thank you. I encourage you all to follow their website if you're interested in what they do. Of course, you should follow the amerikahaus website. There are over 400 events a year here. They're wonderful, like the Lee Miller exhibit. I hope you saw some of the pictures that are here now that you can enjoy tonight afterwards. And of course, our mailing list, dialoguesondemocracy.com. If you sign up, then we send you an email when we're having an event. We have a fantastic turnout tonight. The house is full. I'm so pleased, and I also want to take the time now to welcome our online audience. The fact that so many of you showed up speaks to the fact that we all have this deep desire right now to do something to defend democracy, to support democracy, and to hear from thoughtful people who can help us sort of navigate the turbulence that is all around us. We've been planning this evening for many, many months. I was really thrilled to get Professor Ignatieff, but honestly, who knew that Canada was going to become so important? It was not on my bingo card. So many of you know that I am a US citizen, but not many of you probably know that my great-grandparents were Canadian. They were born in Toronto, raised in Belleville, and proud graduates, at least my grandfather, of Queen's University in Kingston. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of stories like mine in North America, which will hopefully provide the glue for our continuing friendship at all levels. So, and then when we talked about the topic for tonight, months ago, you sent me Democracy in the New World Order. Great. I don't think either one of us thought that both democracy and the New World Order would be going so sideways so fast, right? So we've got a lot to talk about tonight. I'm going to leave the introduction of our guest to our moderator, but I'd like to read a few sentences from the jury for the prestigious Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences that our guest won last year. Professor Ignatieff won for his defense of human rights and his analysis of political conflicts. And they wrote, Michael Ignatieff's broad-ranging and varied career stands out for his defense of fundamental and universal human rights and values. Through his books, articles, and television programs, he has contributed ideas for overcoming ethnic and religious differences and the search for common values within the context of globalization. They continue, his intense, multifaceted professional career, which ranges from the study of history and philosophy to the practice of journalism and politics, is characterized by the application of critical thought to the major political conflicts of our time. So I'm curious to see how many of these political conflicts we will get to tonight, but we will be in capable hands. Our moderator tonight is David Ayinger, founding member of Munich Dialogues on Democracy and a member of the DKG. He's a retired Canadian diplomat living here in Munich. He holds degrees in history, law, and international relations from his studies in Canada, the US, and the UK. And his posts overseas were Geneva, Washington, D.C., Madrid, and 9 years at the Canadian Embassy in Berlin. I'm honored to call him a friend. Now, tonight we're going to be using Slido as always, so we will have time for questions after the conversation and the talk. And so you go to slido.com, #amerikahaus. If you're at home, put in your questions. If you're here, you can use your phone. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So with a special welcome to the Canadian government representatives that are here, and I found out the Ukrainian government representatives that are here, and a very... And of course, a very warm welcome to our guest. I'm happy to turn the floor over to our moderator, David, now.
Well, thank you, Bartley. Ladies and gentlemen, chers amis de la démocratie et du Canada, our friends online, it is truly an honor to have the opportunity to say a few words about Michael Ignatieff before he gives us his personal take on tonight's theme of democracy and the New World Order. Some might call it the New World Disorder. Now, I'm not even going to try to attempt to provide you with a comprehensive Lebenslauf for Mr. Ignatieff. You're here to hear him speak and not me, and doing a credible job of describing his impressive multifaceted career would take a lot of time. So I thought I would provide you with more of a thematic introduction to our speaker. He is a remarkable man who can draw on his equally remarkable experiences. Firstly, Mr. Ignatieff is a Canadian. As a Canadian myself, I've always been happy to point to Canadians who have done interesting things in their lives. But suddenly, in the last 2 months, as Bartley just mentioned, being Canadian has taken on a critical political and cultural importance that is very different from anything I've seen during my lifetime. Secondly, Mr. Ignatieff is a self-confessed liberal, a bad word in some quarters, as we know. In a Washington Post article in January this year, after noting he was born liberal, he provided an excellent analysis of the challenges facing liberalism today and how we got here, with some pretty pointed criticism of liberal leaders, including himself, that struck a chord with me, also a liberal. Of course, Mr. Ignatieff is not merely a small L liberal, but was the leader of the Canadian Federal Liberal Party. During his time as Member of Parliament and Leader of Opposition, the party faced challenges that may well hold important lessons for Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Thirdly, Michael Ignatieff is a thinker. I shy away from using the words intellectual and academic because, like the word liberal, these have become laden with baggage in some circles. As Bartley mentioned in his introduction, the body of his written and television work represents a magnificent chronicle of the times through which he has lived. I personally am fascinated not only by the breadth of the subject matter to which his intellectual curiosity has led, but also by the fact that he has turned his hand to the different requirements of academic, journalistic, historical, and even fiction writing, always with the same degree of critical success. It's almost as if he uses these different styles of media to identify conflict and problems and to place them in the most appropriate context to foster thought and solutions. Finally, Mr. Ignatieff has not only been on the Canadian political front line, but also on one of the trickiest fault lines within Europe. He had the experience of leading the Central European University in Budapest at exactly the time that Viktor Orban started to flex his illiberal muscles, taking hostile actions, big and small, that eventually led to the university moving to its present home in Vienna. We could probably talk about that episode for the whole evening. But now it's time to turn the floor over to Michael. We are very looking forward to hearing your views on how our suddenly very topsy-turvy world can make its way through the next 4 weeks, the next 4 months, and particularly the next 4 years.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see you here. Thank you to everybody who's involved in the invitation. It's wonderful to see Americans and Canadians working so well together and so affectionately together. That's good for the soul. It's also good to be back in amerikahaus. I was here once before. It's fitting to be doing what we're doing at amerikahaus because it's a living symbol of what I hope is not a vanished era. amerikahaus begins in 1945 with what I think many Germans remember as a benign imperial occupation that turned into friendship. And the friendship between Germany and America goes much deeper than politics. It goes to music and rock and roll and movies and poetry and art and literature and people like Lee Miller. So this is a wonderful venue to talk to you. And I want to talk about these subjects for a little while, and then David's going to give me a hard time, and then all of you are going to give me an even harder time when we have questions, and I'm looking forward to that. So let me start. In his theses on history, written before he took his life after failing to escape from Nazi Germany and occupied France, the German writer and theorist Walter Benjamin wrote a text that many of you probably know, which evoked the angel of history. He created a wonderful image, a haunting image of the angel moving backward into the future, watching the ruins of the past pile up behind her. And I wanted to start there because we're in a historical moment, but it's a characteristic of historical moments that we don't have any idea how it's going to turn out. All we can do is walk backwards into the future like the angel of history. We always walk backwards into the future, and we always walk backwards watching the ruins of the past pile up in front of us. And so the only way we can anticipate and prepare for the future, I think, is to look carefully at those ruins, to look carefully at the path that brought us to this moment, and understand the pattern that time begins to assume when we survey it retrospectively. Benjamin, as you know, put the emphasis on the tragic nature of our relation to the past, the fact that the past cannot deliver us predictive certainty about the future. But I would put it, because I'm a Canadian, slightly more optimistically. I do believe, because I'm a professional historian, because I was teaching a history class at 12:30 today, we can understand the past. It's the only tool we have to anticipate the future and avoid the worst that it might bring. We're always facing the wrong way. We're always backing into the future. But all of us tonight, over the last months, have felt the future coming at us like the thunder of a train that we can feel shaking the ground beneath our feet. And that feeling, the future coming at us like a train, is especially strong in revolutionary moments, and we may be living a revolutionary moment. It's a moment filled with rage and fear, and I could join with many others in denunciation, fury, vituperation, sarcasm, irony, but I'm more interested in trying to understand how the hell we got here, because I think that's what we desperately need. We need much more than moral anger or moral distaste. We desperately need to understand the path that brought us to this moment. The conventional answer, of course, about why we're in this moment is that this revolutionary moment begins on a quite specific date, January the 20th, 2025, when the President of the United States swore the oath of office. But I think this is magical thinking. I think pretending that the world has changed just because one country has chosen to elect a destructive trickster as its president is to fail to understand how he got elected in the first place. It's to fail to understand how he stands at the end of a historical process that we desperately need to understand. We need to understand why he was elected, what historical factors made his coming to power possible. And I want to do that for a while, and then bear with me a bit, and then I would like to talk about what Europe and Canada need to do to be up to the historical challenge we face. So then the question for all of us is, when did this moment begin? If it didn't begin in January 20th, 2025, when did it begin? One of the hints that I would have here is that we need to remember something about the president's biography. He's a baby boomer, like me. He was born in 1946. And so the first thing that you know is that his experience, like my experience, was of the unprecedented economic boom that America experienced and Canada experienced after 1945. What the French call les 30 Glorieuses. The first 20, 30 years of his life are the halcyon days of American prosperity and American hegemony. And I think that tells you one crucial thing that is at the base of his political appeal. It's angry nostalgia for a vanished past, for an America that's gone forever. That's the first thing. So it starts in the 60s. What else is going on in the 60s? He comes of age, he's 21 in the 1960s, as I was, and he comes of age in an era of civil rights. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, feminism, gay rights, this extraordinary explosion of emancipation that created the world that I, as a liberal, rejoice in. Whatever the hell mistakes liberals made, we got that one right. People in this room are freer. They have better lives as women, as gay men and women. As people of color, they have better lives because of the revolution that unspooled in the 1960s and 70s. But let's be honest to note that that moment of emancipatory change was also the moment of the beginning of a counter-revolution. For every person of color, every gay man and woman, every person emancipated by the 60s, there were Americans, particularly white Americans, who thought, we're going to lose. The American South switched Republican in that period and never came back. And the rebellion against woke begins in the 60s, not in the 2020s. It begins then with a sense that the liberal revolution is threatening to the power, prestige, and privilege of the white majority. And then when liberals began to impose speech codes, political correctness, the right way of thinking about diversity, it made things a lot worse. We've got some thinking to do about the ways in which we turned an emancipatory doctrine into a coercive code of political correctness and made the radical counter-revolution gather steam. The other thing that happens in the 60s we need to remember is it's the era of Vietnam. I marched against the war in Vietnam from the time I entered college till 1973, to Nixon's second inaugural. Thousands, millions of people, Germans, everybody, we all marched. And we need to remember that more than 50,000 Americans never came home. And America lost the war. And so the third element in the Trump ideology is the bitterness and disillusion about endless wars. endless wars that we keep losing. And it wasn't just disillusion with endless wars, it was disillusion with the liberal internationalist elites that led America into these wars. And so that's another element of the Trump ideology, which we need to trace back to the 1960s and 70s. And another thing we need to add is that it's also the place in which the divide between the MAGA Republicans, the Trump Republicans, and the conservative Republicans begins. Because whatever you think about Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and George Herbert Walker Bush, they were liberal multilateral internationalists. And they didn't hear what Trump was hearing and parts of the Republican right were hearing, which is, we are tired of being sent off to die, to consolidate imperial hegemony in faraway places, and get our backside shot off while you sit there in Washington and preach liberal internationalism. And so the divide in the Republican Party begins over this issue, the sense of what price young Americans should pay for American hegemony overseas. And then we come to the summer of 1989. You see what I'm doing? I'm leading up to the present. In the summer of 1989, an epical event occurs, which is the Tiananmen Square repression of a demonstration in favor of freedom. And suddenly America, which had thought, we have provided global public goods and globalization in part because we think that this will draw authoritarian communist regimes into the capitalist world, and we will get economic liberalization and political liberalization together. And in June 1989, we all got slapped awake and told, that's not going to happen. But this had a consequence I think we didn't notice, which is that a lot of conservative Americans looked at the ways in which America had funded and supported globalization with free public goods like global navigation, the whole structure of international trade that encouraged China's rise. Part of the reason for doing that would be to liberalize the Chinese regime and draw it into the international order. And instead what happened is all that effort by American foreign policy had ended up creating an extremely substantial, tough, relentless peer competitor. And that, again, unsettles the confidence that American elites have in the ways in which they use globalization to further American interests. And then in the autumn of 1989, the wall comes down, and all of us, I remember it painfully well, were euphoric about the ways in which liberal democracy had triumphed, and Francis Fukuyama told us history was over. And in a Soviet outpost in Dresden, a young KGB agent was busily burning papers and thinking to himself, this is the greatest disaster of the 20th century. While we were celebrating, he was weeping and beginning to plot the revenge that reaches its culmination in 2022. The West doesn't realize that Russia, stripped of its empire, faces an existential challenge of its own, which is to answer the question, what are our frontiers? And they look at an independent Ukraine and remember that Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire and think we've been amputated. And then if you move forward to 9/11, I'm trying to construct the narrative of historical change over 60 years that allows us to understand the world and the argument that Trump has made so successfully to the American electorate. On 9/11, and I was teaching at Harvard at the time, a superpower is humbled by a mass casualty attack, And Americans discover that this omnipotent deep state that has such fantastic intelligence capabilities did not catch in time the worst mass casualty attack since Pearl Harbor. Does that contribute to disillusion with the American state and with American power? You bet. And when you then go to war for 20 years to stamp out the terrorist threat, and it ends in ignominious defeat in Afghanistan in 22, that consolidates the view that American power is in crisis. And then, because this is Munich, there's the Munich Security Conference of 2007, when that ex-KGB that KGB operative in Dresden is suddenly the president of Russia and begins to say to the West, we do not accept the post-1989 political settlement, and we are going to contest not just, we're going to reassert a new set of borders for our country, don't say we weren't warned, but we're also going to contest unipolar dominance by the American hegemon. And then 2008, suddenly this 30 years of globalization is disrupted by a massive economic crisis. The seizing up of the global economy further weakens confidence in the American state, but it also throws the life chances, possibly of people in this room, into reverse. And suddenly Trump has a constituency of young Americans who feel the promise of the American dream has failed them. And then finally, 2019, we come to that little virus that starts in a Chinese fish and flesh market in Wuhan. It spreads first to the neighborhood, and then it spreads to the city, and then suddenly it spread to the whole world. We have to shut the world down. And again, a tragic irony. This might have been a moment in which we all come out believing in the credibility of science, the capacity of science in incredibly short periods of time to develop life-saving vaccines. We could have come out of it believing that our supposedly fragile, weak liberal states actually rose to the challenge and saved hundreds of thousands of lives by effective quarantine. But in the United States, the effect is to redouble suspicion of science on the one hand and redouble suspicion of the invasive, incompetent, illiberal state. And so these are the ruins that the angel of history sees as she walks backward into the future. And there's one other historical factor that's tremendously important to put into focus. The dawn of the 21st century is the dawn of the internet. It's the dawn of social media. It's the dawn of the cell phone. We have the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria on our phones. And the one politician in the Western world who understands immediately the potential of that technology is Donald Trump. Because he understands it allows him to vault over the gatekeepers, the opinion gatekeepers, which had structured public opinion in Western democracies and in America for my lifetime. It allows him to reach directly into the cerebral cortex of millions of Americans, and it empowers them like the priesthood of old believers. It's like the Gutenberg Revolution again, to create their own truths, their own realities, their own facts. And he's a genius at jumping into that opinion formation and structuring it with a narrative which assembles all the facts I've given into you into a picture of what he calls American carnage. He's a politician entertainer with a genius for understanding the technological possibilities that have been opened up by the 21st century. And he knits together a narrative that pulls all these changes together. It's a new language of a beleaguered hegemon confronting the historic rise of a rival, confronting the irony that free trade globalization that they had championed, that America had championed for 80 years, had caused it to lose primacy in the leading technologies of the new era. And it led to a very clear agenda. America must stop providing free global public goods to the Germans, to the Canadians, to everybody, because these people have used the global public goods and protection provided by the United States to become rivals and competitors. Europe is a competitor. Canada is a competitor. China is a competitor. And the point I want to make is that this language has deep democratic appeal. Free trade has never been popular in the American manufacturing hinterland. We know as Canadians because it was not easy to get the free trade deal done originally. Tremendous domestic resistance in the United States 30, 40 years ago. So, disillusion with free trade, disillusion with endless war, and what this illuminates is something that I don't think has been said enough. There's a very unstable relationship, historically, between American hegemony and American democracy. American citizens are asking, for the first time in a way, and saying the price of hegemony is too high for us. It is taking allies and empowering them to become competitors. Free trade is not working for us. The global goods we provide are a ripoff. And this unstable relationship between hegemony and democracy is, I think, driving us into the future. It is also the case that American democracy is now in crisis. When you pick up your newspapers, it is an open question whether the president will defy court orders from the highest courts in the land, and this will end up in the Supreme Court. So we're at a moment of enormous tension in the viability of one of the oldest democracies in the world. But the point here is that this challenge to liberal democracy mounted by the administration has enormous popular support. That's the point that's important to grasp, not to see this as the kind of crazed behavior of a small coterie of lunatics. The more disturbing fact is that it's anchored in a great cry of anger and fury, much of it manipulated by the American public. There's a wholesale popular uprising against the American constitutional system, which began with the riot to prevent the certification of a free and fair election in 2001, and it's now been followed by a systematic attempt to dismantle the federal government, its programs and services. And in this, he and Musk have a good deal of support. Millions of Americans think the federal government is an enemy of liberty. They think the judiciary is thwarting the will of the majority. They believe Trump when he says he will free America from parasitic allies like Europe and Canada, reshore jobs from overseas, and make America great again. So if this is a coup, a rapidly moving overturning of the checks and balances of the American Constitution, it's a coup, unfortunately, folks, with Democratic support. That's what makes this a genuine moment of crisis, a genuinely revolutionary moment. So we have a unique but by no means unprecedented phenomenon of democracy destroying democracy. The Weimar parallels will surge into every German's mind, but what's interesting is how different this situation is. We're not talking about an economy at 30% unemployment. We're not talking about a country that's just been forced to accept an unjust peace. We're not talking about all the conditions that made the Weimar democracy so fragile. This is happening in the old established liberal democracy on earth. And so I'm trying to find a narrative that begins to assemble why this didn't just suddenly start on the 20th of January 2025. So let me go quickly over what I also want to say, because I don't want to leave you in despair. I want to talk a little bit about what what Europe and Canada can do. What's interesting about Europe and Canada is we have the same challenge, we have the same dilemma in ways that I want to spell out a little bit. We need to maintain the viability and legitimacy of our democratic institutions. We need to defend our sovereignty, and we need to rediscover our agency. There's some weird way in which 70 years of dependence on the Americans have left us strangely infantilized, strangely slow to grasp what remains within our power, within our capability. And recovering that sense of agency, that sense that we can do things and do them fast, that psychological work that we have to do inside is tremendously important, because it means we need to form alliances, pool resources, strengthen the capacity for united action. That translates into a very specific thing, creating interoperable defense capabilities with procurement across 27 countries. We need to diversify our export markets to reduce dependency on the American market. We need to listen to Mario Draghi. Draghi is saying to you, Europeans, you can't be a competitive economy in the 21st century unless you have efficient, centralized capital markets. You've got to raise huge amounts of dough if you want to stay in the AI game. And if you have fragmented capital markets, you're not going to get there. You're not going to get there if you have fragmented labor markets. The interesting thing is that's the same problem in Canada, identical problem in Canada. We have fragmented labor markets and fragmented capital markets, and we have got to get rid of them to build one national economy, one capacity to raise large amounts of capital. If we can't do that, we don't have an economic future in the 21st century. We need to strengthen common border protection. We need to get past our ridiculous arguments about migration. We need migration because we have declining populations, but we have to have a simplified, lawful migration stream that opens up pathways to citizenship for some, offering temporary but renewable entry to others, coupled with, and this is the part liberals don't like, but we have to say it, with credible repatriation of illegals. You can't maintain the legitimacy of a democratic system if you don't know who the hell is in the country, right? You can't sustain liberal democracy if you have illegal migration which you no longer control, because it becomes an issue for the public of, do we control our country? Do we control our borders? This is a legitimate question. I'm the son of refugees and immigrants. I couldn't be more in favor of migration. Nobody could. But you can't sustain a migration system without a repatriation system for illegals. Now, what Europe needs to do, Canada needs to do. Common capital and labor markets, break down internal market barriers, tighten up border security, repatriate illegals, reinvest in defense capabilities, and decrease our dependence on the U.S. But probably the most important thing is to get that dependent child out of us that depended so long on our powerful American friends. There's a psychic change in here that I feel very strongly. I spent 15 years in the United States. Let me make it clear. I cede to no one in my affection, even love for American life and culture. But it was not good for our psyches to depend so deeply on our neighbor to the south. And now we have to wake up and stand up and take control of our destiny. Thanks so much for listening.
Are we on? Yes. Well, Michael, I've just jotted down about 25 questions, and I'm sure that everybody else in the audience has been looking at this as well. Amazing. In the very short time you were speaking, you frightened me a great deal. You also gave me a new somewhat unwilling and scary respect for Donald Trump, which may not have been a good outcome for this evening. We're going to have questions, but I wanted to, one thing that you said at the very end is that you basically encouraged the European Union and Canada to stop operating as our little fiefdoms, the independent states and then the provinces in Canada. But yet, isn't what's happening in the United States right now in many sectors under Donald Trump the reverse of that? The Department of Education, as far as we know, is about to be disbanded, and all of its functions are going to be farmed out to the individual 50 states. How does that weaken America at the same time as you're encouraging us to strengthen ourselves by doing the opposite?
I don't think there's any, I don't think there's any doubt that some of the actions taken by the Trump administration since January will weaken the United States long term. You cited the cuts to education. I mean, again, as a historian, if you ask yourself, why has American medicine and biotech led the world? Why has American electrical engineering and computing led the world? The answer is the partnership between the federal government of the United States and universities from 1945. It began during the war as a war effort, and it has produced absolutely spectacular results. It's given America the best universities in the world. No disrespect to Europe, no disrespect to Canada, but they just are the best. They're the best because of a private-public partnership of staggering effectiveness. And these people don't understand what they're doing. They're burning down the house. But I think that what we need to think, instead of sitting there and saying, you're being very unwise, you know, the great universities in this city should be recruiting some American talent. Should be recruiting some American scientists. And they're not just American. They've been attracted from all over the world. But, you know, let me deal with another detail. If you arrest a green card holder who's married to a U.S. citizen, you have a chilling effect on every single person who's thinking of applying to an American graduate school. You know, it's just, every action has consequences, and these folks are going to wake up to some serious consequences. But we can't sit there placidly watching them trash their own society. That's not our business. There's nothing we can do about it. They're going to do what they're going to do. What we need to do is to seize the opportunity, for example, to welcome those international academics, those international scientists who want to work in Canada and want to work in Europe. We got to look at our regulations and see how we can make them welcome.
Great. I have just one more question from my own part before. There aren't too many questions here yet, so please send them in if you are interested. One thing that interests me about Donald Trump in particular is his real estate background. Real estate is, everywhere he's worked, a limited commodity. And we do see a great deal of the concept of the zero-sum game. There's always, he talks about winning all the time. And, you know, and there's, in his nostalgia, there's a nostalgia for a time when Americans are winners. But the question is, who were the winners in that society that he is so fond of looking back at?
This relates to our dilemma, Europe and Canada, because I think what's been so astonishing to us is that we can't understand why he doesn't understand that alliances are good for the United States, why it's a win-win. As you say, he has a win-lose. If I win, you have to lose. It's the only way he can, I get the real estate, I get the land, I get the property, and you don't. That's how it works in his mind. But the whole alliance structure of the post-war world was based on a sense that this is good for Germany and it's good for the United States. Now, he has a crude sense that he's not going to walk out of Ramstein anytime soon, right? I mean, huge American assets are committed still in Germany. Sorry? He tried that 4 years ago. Well, he may try it again. You lose Ramstein, you lose Ramstein, you're shooting not just 1 foot, you're shooting both feet. But that again is his problem. There's almost nothing we can do anymore to change this mindset. The key, I think, is thinking about how Europe overcomes some hesitations that it's had about, for example, sharing nuclear deterrence. This is a hugely difficult issue. The most effective nuclear deterrent that Europe has, as you know, is under the command of the President of France. And the President of France says, I'm willing to consider a situation in which we protect Germany, or we protect Poland, or right. But that's a very difficult, that involves a tremendous amount of thinking and talking and working, but that's what we need to do. We can't, I think that Hegseth and Trump will try and reduce the American military complement in Germany. He's tried, as one of our questioners said. He'll try and do it again. There's not much we can do to stop that. He's going to do that, he's going to do that. Our challenge is to think about, okay, so how do we make sure that Rheinmetall starts producing more weapons? We get cooperation between European countries instead of ridiculous, talk about zero-sum competition, ridiculous competition. We're too small to compete this way. We've got to get together. And if we do that, I think we're going to do very well. Canada, for example, last week, to everybody's surprise, did a deal for an over-the-horizon radar system developed by the Australians. It would be effective and prudent for us to reduce our dependency on American weaponry. We continue to use American weaponry, but it would be good to diversify. And then the more difficult conversation, unless you think I'm a kind of militarist, is figure out what kit we actually need. What is a defense posture that's actually credible? I mean, the thing that the Ukrainians, and it's wonderful to have representatives of a heroic government in the hall, but one of the things that the Ukrainians have been doing for us is revolutionizing 21st century warfare. And we need to sit down with the Ukrainians long and hard and learn from them about what it is to fight a drone warfare in the 21st century, because they're the world experts. And while we're at it, it seems to me the security guarantee that is an absolute bottom line that Europe must insist on, that Canada must insist on, is that the Ukrainian military must continue to have the means to defend the country. They must continue to have resupply. And if the Americans cut off the resupply, Europe has to step up. This is coming at us very quickly in the next couple of months. It's entirely possible that in order to get the deal, the Trump administration will threaten to shut off the flow of weapons and force Ukraine to a peace which I think will endanger the security of Europe. So that's the bottom line. Everybody talks about security guarantees. The security guarantees that matter are in the hands of the Ukrainian military. They have to be resupplied so they can defend their damn country. That's what it's about. Europe can send in peacekeepers, although I think it's extremely unlikely that any European or NATO-based peacekeepers will be accepted on Ukrainian territory. That's, to me, a side issue. The absolutely central issue is to make sure that Ukraine has the means to defend itself. Sorry to get on it.
That's all right. Actually, there was a question from Carl that I think you've just done a good job of answering. But I'm reminded of the news, I think last night or the night before, about the White Book on European defense. And somebody very appropriately said, I don't think Mr. Putin is going to be very impressed if we wave a book at him.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
I think there are a couple of questions here that have to do with the United States. So you lived there long enough, you certainly have studied the place enough. One is the question of, and it's an anonymous question. I think it's a deep question that's been put in a very simple way. And I wonder whether it's even possible to imagine this. How can one bring Democrats and Republicans together? What are their common values, if any? And I think this is related to a question by Rolf, which is, do you believe the damage to American democracy caused by Trump will be permanent, or is there some kind of a way out, a reawakening that can happen at some point?
Let me tack another thing onto this, which is the Trump administration's transformation of American foreign policy temporary or permanent? And then do the question about the democracy. I actually think, and this is difficult and painful, that a generational change has happened. He's the last baby boomer president the United States is going to have. The next generation is coming up. And even if you got a Democratic president in 2028, I think we're permanently in a new world in which Europe has to defend itself. Europe has to develop lead technologies to sustain and grow its economies. Canada will have similar challenges. I think relations will improve. But one of the effects of, and I've written about this a little, one of the effects of betrayal psychologically is when it's happened, you may forgive, but you don't forget. And I think a lot of Europeans feel a sense of betrayal. And I tell you, a lot of Canadians feel a sense of betrayal about what's happened. And betrayal is a very deep, once it happens, you don't forget. I think Ukrainians have a reason to feel, after the unbelievable scene in which a president of a country fighting for its life is told to get on his knees and be grateful to the Americans. I don't think Ukrainians will ever forget that. I think it's one of those moments that just goes in and never comes out. So it changes the nature of these relations forever. It means they all become more transactional. Everybody knows Europe will need to have good and strong relations with America, but it's a much more transactional feeling now, a much more trust but verify, let me see the money first kind of relationship than it was based on common values, common this, common that. I don't think that's coming back.
Anytime soon.
That's the bad news. As for democracy, there's no question that there are lots of Republicans, millions of Republicans, wonderful people, patriotic Americans, deeply devoted to the Constitution of the United States. There's plenty of ground between liberals and conservatives in a common attachment to the American constitutional system, to American freedom and American liberty. It's there, but there are enormous costs, political costs, to collaboration. You can get punished if you're seen talking to a Democrat. You can get punished if you're seen to withholding a vote that the President of the United States needs. This is a brutal business. You put your head above the parapet, and you
become Liz Cheney.
And you become Liz Cheney, or you become the Republican candidate for president in 2004. It just steamrolled. He had the courage, enormous courage, to vote articles of impeachment against the president, and that consigned him to the American equivalent of political Siberia. So I don't think the problem is that there lacks common ground. The problem is we have a politics in which you are punished for bipartisanship instantly. And somebody at some point is going to have to stand up. I'm old enough and fond enough of America to remember that amazing moment, which I've seen on black and white TV, when Joseph Welch in the McCarthy hearings finally looked over at Senator McCarthy and said, "Have you no shame, sir?" There's a moment when this will break, is what I'm saying. There have been moments in the American past when it's broke, when somebody just awakened people's sense of shame and embarrassment at what's happening, and it will happen. I'm enough of a believer in American democracy to believe there's plenty of common ground, but we've got to stop the punishment. And the punishment is done not simply by the Trump side, it's also done by the Democratic side. The punishment's got to stop, because the Republic is in danger. And maybe I'm sentimental, but I believe that when the Republic is in danger, some of these quarrels will cease.
Great. We have two questions, one from Peter and one anonymous, that are quite similar to each other. One is basically, are democracies in Europe vulnerable to the same illiberal trends that ultimately brought Trump to office? What can Europe do to avoid cracking from within? And the same is, the USA is not unique. We can see similarities in Brexit, AFD, and tendencies in Canada, etc. How do we connect and protect against these currents?
Well, it depends on you, doesn't it? I mean, this is really a moment in which European democracy is being challenged. I mean, let me tell you some hopeful stories, since I seem to be spreading an absolute unrelenting wash of gloom over there. I mean, last weekend, I'm married to a Hungarian, wonderful. One of the best things that ever happened to me was marrying a Hungarian. Last weekend, there were 70,000 people in the streets of Budapest protesting the Orban regime, and in every poll for the last 6 months, he's running behind the opposition. So that's important. Pay close attention to what happens in Hungary, because Orban has had enormous influence in driving the European far right, and if he suffers a political defeat at home, that's good news for every European, in my view. That would be one bit of hopeful news. The other thing that I have read, but it's just a newspaper columnist's opinion, is that Trump's regime will, having trashed the economy and trashed the federal government, will self-destruct in such a way that the entire prestige of that kind of populist politics will be discredited in Europe. That is, if it goes very badly for the Americans, it might go much better for Europe. You don't want to wish that on America, frankly, but it is kind of amusing. I have retirement savings invested in America, and I occasionally look at what's happening to the stock market, and I'm in the ridiculous position of wanting my own savings to go down in value so that it sends a signal up the top. So we're all in this kind of complicated situation. But again, I think it's bad politics to wish economic harm on anybody. But I think the Trump experiment is transforming politics right across the world. And some of you will be aware that in Canada, my party was 20 points down in the polls on the 1st of January. And on the 20th of March, where we are, it's at level pegging with the Conservatives. And the reason for that is that our Conservative Party looked like a mini Trump party. And that was working until Trump was inaugurated. And the minute Canadians looked at what a Trump administration looks like, they fled to our party. So make of that what you will, but it might be a sign that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that may be happening.
I'm glad you mentioned Canada, because, of course, we're both Canadians up on the stage here, and it's good to have something about Canada in here. And that's a very interesting comment. But
do you take direct questions or direct
if you let me ask a question first, I'll let you ask a question right afterwards. Okay. The other world besides Canada and Europe that you live in is the academic world. And universities seem to be troubled places these days. They're troubled from the inside, and now, certainly in the United States, they are quite troubled from the outside with respect to funding, with respect to punishment. You've seen that in Hungary. Maybe you have a couple of comments about where universities are going. Are they going to turn into these beautiful Salamancas that basically lost all of its credibility because it was the arm of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I've spent some of the happiest years of my life in universities, 15 years at Harvard, and then coming up for 10 years at this kind of strange place, Central European University, to which I've got tremendously fond, partially because it's the kind of place where you have Ukrainians and Russians studying in the same classroom, which is kind of interesting, and that's diversity, let me tell you. I feel that at the very highest level, the one thing I think about universities that's not said enough, but which I learned in Budapest, when we were attacked by Viktor Orban, there was one wonderful May afternoon. Some of you will know the Chain Bridge in Budapest. It's a beautiful bridge right in the middle of the city. 80,000 people crossed that bridge and walked past our building when we were under attack by Orban. And they were chanting a slogan in Hungarian, which I think is a real message for all of us. The slogan was, "Free universities for a free society." In other words, there's a deep connection between the freedoms of a free society and academic freedom. We don't think of the universities as part of the constitutional fabric of a liberal democracy. But it is like checks and balances. It is like an independent judiciary. It is like a free media. A free university's rationale is to do something that's becoming more and more and more important in a society dominated by social media, which is that there has to be a place where people's job is assessing truth claims. Just deciding, I'm going to use a vulgar American expression, sorting the shit from the shinola. We are in desperate need of places which ask empirical questions and seek answers, try to establish more or less what's true and what's false. Universities have no monopoly on that, but they're a crucial place where that happens. And universities have often let themselves down because I'm a liberal, but often they've been taken over by liberals and turned into cathedrals of liberal orthodoxy. And that's fatal to this knowledge function. And so we need to get back into the business for which we exist, which is trying to help a society to find the facts, the knowledge upon which to make public choice. And universities have had a huge role and positive role in doing that. And that's the business we need to get back into.
Right. Now we're 5 minutes over our time already. Bartley, how much time have I got? Yeah, okay, good. Then, perfect. If you can speak loudly, you can ask your question.
Okay, loudly. In principle, we agree. But I would point to first to mention Fukuyama. It was not just Fukuyama, it was hunting, in fact. The political and intellectual elite of the 40 democracies that we have assume that the liberal world order is coming before too long, and they acted on this basis. And they were surprised. Democracy was left out because the majority of states are run by authoritarian the isolationism, the neo-isolationism of Trump, all what he says and what he does. America first goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. There's nothing new. The Committee of America First acted against Roosevelt's participation in the war, supporting Churchill and fighting Hitler. The first Wilson's policy was
we need a question. We need a question.
Now listen, either we have a discussion or what do you mean by question? No, I will stop it and will tell you what is.
Yes.
Should I ask a question? No, I wanted to contribute to the discussion.
Oh.
I wanted to contribute to a discussion.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I think what I take from that is I started my story in 1967, and you're telling me it goes back a lot further than that. Bingo, good, correct. But I had 30 minutes.
And we can discuss this afterwards outside as well. We have a question from Derek from Frankfurt and Edmonton, so this is good. What narrative would you suggest to counter the deep state issue of too much government in Europe, given the different levels of government in the EU?
I'm sure I don't have a good answer to that. I just have instincts which I can share with you. I'm a big state liberal. I grew up in an innocent world where Canada was creating its welfare state, creating a public pension system, creating a national health system. Germany lived through the same experiment of the social welfare state after 1945. And I'm in some sense a captive of that happy period when liberalism created the enabling social justice state. But I think liberals have to ask honestly whether the states we've got now are fit for purpose. Little things, my wife goes in to renew her passport in Canada and it takes, 7 months or something. I was talking to somebody before we came in here, and they were saying similar stories about how often inefficient, callous, sometimes corrupt the state has become. I think liberals underestimate how hostile many of our citizens are towards the experience of dealing with the state, how impersonal sometimes, how unfriendly, how just old-fashioned and unable to use the latest technologies. What's disturbing about Elon Musk's attack on the federal government is that it is not awakening outrage. I think it will when he attacks Social Security. I think it's coming. He might not just attack Social Security in pursuit of the tiny percentage of people who use it fraudulently, but he may be doing it actually to hoover up confidential information from the Social Security system, which would be, that has to go to the Supreme Court and he has to be whacked, because that's just a complete violation of everything a decent government does. It must maintain the confidentiality of personal data. But I think the larger lesson for us is kind of how do we reinvent the state? And let me just say one thing about Canada. One of the things, and it may be resonant in Germany, I don't know, we have a kind of permission state in which every time we try and do something like build a railway from Windsor, Ontario to Quebec City, which is 1,500 kilometers. We have to get permission from everybody. Every time we build a pipeline, we have to get permission from Aboriginal groups, local groups, this group, that group. Democracy and consultation has begun to make it impossible to do anything. And I'm a Democrat. I profoundly believe in consultation, but consultation has become the process, not the outcome. There's a recent book which just cataloged the attempt of California to build high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles. They've spent $30 billion, and there still isn't a train between Los Angeles and San Francisco. They can't get it done. This is a real challenge to liberalism. If you believe in the state, an enabling, compassionate state that puts granite under all our feet, which I do, it better damn well do the job and be efficient and get things done. So I think we've got a big challenge here. Instead of just defending the state, we're going to have to change and reform it and make it more efficient. And the most difficult thing for all of us is to reform democracy so that democracy doesn't become an active enemy of change, an enemy of progress, an enemy of infrastructure, an enemy of the things we all need to see that must be changed.
Right. I think we have a lot of specific questions, which I think will have to be taken outside the room. But I think on a closing one, this is a chance for you to be hopeful, but if you choose to take it. But is democracy sufficiently well adapted to the future to be a viable political system to address the challenges of humanity? I'm reminded by the old discussion about democracy. Well, it's not very good, but compared with all the other alternatives, it's not bad.
Well, we've all learned to be a little less ideological and a little more humble about this. I'm a believer in human rights universals, but I am not in the business of prescribing democracy as a solution and as the ideal regime type for every society. I think we've all had to learn not just different strokes for different folks, but constantly reproaching China for not being a functioning democracy is not going to get us anywhere at all. It's entirely appropriate for us to remonstrate when China abuses and mistreats people. The Uyghurs are the most prominent example, but religious groups and on and on. It's a horrible regime, But we're not about to change it with admonition. We're not about to change it. We have to live with it. And so we have to live in a world where authoritarianism is going to be pretty strong. But I do think that and some of this will be controversial, that democracy has an incredible epistemological advantage when combined with free markets. And that is the controversial part, since we all hate capitalism and despise it, et cetera, et cetera. But the instinct behind a genuinely free society, a genuinely participatory, active democracy, is that many voices are better than one, that single authority has the dictator's dilemma. That is, Putin is always being told the sun is shining outside, Your Royal Highness. Everything's going fantastic in Ukraine. The peasants are happy. Everything's fine, until suddenly it isn't. Democracy's decentralization of power is an enormous source of epistemological strength, in the sense that the bad news reaches the top very, very quickly. And the capacity of democracies to adapt and act decisively. I mean, I felt in many societies that COVID was a magnificent story of adaptability, resilience, and just sheer, fantastic stuff. being done by governments in alliance with science. I mean, I just think, you know, we take for granted that, again, this is why I love universities, they had been studying viruses for 30 years in underfunded federal programs, and then when they're asked to produce an RNA vaccine, they do it in 2 bloody weeks. We forget this. And they did it because we have these fluid, adaptive societies in which the power is not funneled top down. Somebody in an Oxford lab suddenly says, well, we really ought to do a deal with AstraZeneca because they've got the capacity to produce this. I've got the RNA vaccine, let's put it together. The UK government then makes that happen, and suddenly we're in business, and thousands of people's lives are saved. We're so down on democracy that we need to remember the stories when we did pretty well. And so the epistemological privilege of democracy is that, you know, many voices are often much better and much smarter than one. And having been in politics, the humbling thing about democracy and the wonderful thing about it is that someone always has a better idea than you do. You know? My career, by the way, was a fantastic success. You have no idea. I was a tremendous success. You need to remember that. But I did learn from my failure, in fact, to have much more confidence and respect for the democratic judgment of people and the capacity of free people to respond when they are appealed to. You never forget. I mean, you know, and I'm a creature of people who went through the war and saw what democratic societies were able to do when they were existentially challenged, and you just never forget that. So let's go out into the night having confidence in ourselves and having confidence in democracy, affection for it, respect, and a determination to make it better. There we go.
Indeed.
It was wonderful, and on that note, go out and enjoy the Lee Miller pictures, and those of you who signed up for the dinner tonight, it's upstairs in the Karolinensaal. Thank you.
Thank you.